Actually, I feel there's a very short movie on Swedish television about jumping from a tower into the swimming pool from 10 meters, and different people, how did they behave. And during the day now, I realized these issues, put in a legal perspective, it's like you stand there and you should I or should I not? And I'm here, thanks Thomas for that. but I think that's actually a key thing here, that we should integrate much more, because these issues are not, we need to meet somewhere, and now I'm somewhere between jumping and hitting the water, but well, hopefully in mid-time we learn how to jump into this very, very difficult issues.
Will it be a big splash?
Probably. You could give me an answer later. I think also it's very interesting, because I have done, you said, Marco, 25 years you have worked with this issue, and for myself also, environmental quality standards. In 1999 we had the first regulation on environmental quality standards, but I had worked for it since almost 25-30 years now. So, but from a very legal view, and from a very theoretical view first, because first it was more a legal instrument. What is it, and how to try to define it. And later it has been more on how to implement them, and now it's more on how do they work, how are they used in practice. So an interesting journey. I think we have some, I should also say that I'm mostly have done my studies from a Swedish or European, sorry. Splash. Yeah, Swedish national and European perspective. So that it will also, I think that will show in my presentation. There is some things that we, during today, I think also during the discussion, it's quite obvious that we're talking about many different issues, and I think for myself it's important to differentiate between, when we talk about the baseline, what are the reference value, what are we actually aiming for, what is, as Thomas said before, a non-toxic environment. How could we define that? Is that our objective? How could we then translate that into some kind of wording or figures or whatever? There is also an issue on the level of ambition. What risks are we prepared to take? And then there is the next issue on transformation of these objectives into either environmental quality standards or other types of requirements. And I think that's often where we end up in this type of setting with a ecotoxicologist or a natural scientist. It's also when we talk about ecological status. But I think it's very relevant also in this discussion to bring in what happens next, what is the next step? What are the legal effects of the environmental quality standards and the other types of requirements? How to implement them, the function of programs and measures, or other means of implementation. So, I think although we talk now about environmental quality standards, it's really essential, but still elementary to say that we only can regulate human actors. So historically, we have regulated different types of risks, detriments, and damages. The legislature and the courts have demanded different types of precautions, change behavior, etc., in order to handle risks in the environment. Focus has mostly been, at least from the start, at point sources, larger point sources like industry, sewage plants, etc., and later also on non-point sources. When we look at when it comes to chemicals, of course it's the same thing that we see substances that have been critical or to have some evidence of risks or damage. That's the one that have been or been in focus for the legislators. There has been another approach to also regulate the reactor or the environment, and there has been for a long time a discussion which one of these approaches is the most or the best, and I think today that discussion is closed. Actually, it's not either or, it's a combined approach. But there is also when we talk now about chemical mixtures, some challenges with both of these approaches. So when we look at the regulation on actors, we can see today that almost there is regulation in all these phases or all these types of actors that handle a chemical substance or product. So from producing or importing to the supplier and distributors, retailers, the marketing, consumers, waste or similar. If we take one example on TBT, we have actually tried to follow the whole chain, and you see different types of actors, you see on different levels, you see different approaches, different kind of bans, emission standards, etc., the whole range. And that in relation to the different international, EU and national level makes it quite, or it's not quite, it's very complex, because it's not just environmental law, it's also relates to trade law, to social welfare law, yeah, all different legal areas, I would say. So, talking then about combination effect, we have, I think you're all aware that there is potential to also by legislation to take into consideration in all these, when regulating all these different actors, also the combination effect, but has rarely come into practice. There is some examples, for example, in the biocide regulation, and also relating to the Water Framework Directive, where we see that there is, you could say, an embryo at least of considering mixture effects. But really, as has been pointed out several times today, the legislator has not really recognized and has not been able to recognize the mixture problem. I think an interesting aspect from the FRAM project, I think you mentioned, Thomas, is that what we are doing now is of course again studying how could we develop further these types of regulations that are already existing in order to take or to consider mixture effects, and particularly by pointing out now the different objectives, the actors and events that these actors are included in, and we could study if taxing would be an appropriate instrument. And that, I think, is a new way of, or a new instrument to use. So, taking the other perspective from the environment and talking about then environmental quality standards or similar types of requirements, it is, of course, a response to the additional regulation that is not sufficiently protecting the environment. Although we have legal or the industry, for example, and all different actors that are influencing the environment, if they are they are not criminal, they have legally permits and following all types of restrictions, emission limits, etc. We find out that we have some problems in the environment. It's more, the status is not as we would like. So the response is then to set limits for the environment. But again, it's just humans that can be regulated, so we need to have a link here. And that's what we call sometimes legal operationalization. So going from the quality standards to find out what are the critical load that could be used, or that could be that the environment could handle. How should we share this critical load between different types of actors? You can also call it pollution space. And also then to go to further to legal requirements, sometimes in a frame of programs of measures, and then actually to legal demands or legal requirements on individuals. And I think it's really important to remember this operationalization, because when we talk about even if we not define it as environmental quality standards, that type of standards or requirements that are based in the effect or in the status of the environment, if that has direct links to what we demand from me as an individual or as an industry, that will also lead to cost, that will lead to questions. Why are you requiring this of me? What are your base for that demand? So that is important. So if we then think of EQS for chemical mixtures, we need to think the whole, all the stages here, and be prepared to have some kind of answers. And if we don't want it to link directly from, or we don't find that we have enough sufficient way or methods to define the quality or the effects that we want to regulate, then we should also think, on the other hand, what type of reaction from the society do we want? We maybe don't want them to stop some type of activity or some kind of behavior, but we want them to react somehow. So that signal is important. Yeah. So if we think of the different types of environmental related requirement that we have in the Water Framework Directive, there has been such a long and intense discussion on what is really environmental objectives, what type of legal effect does these objectives have. And we have the ecological status that should be achieved by the member state, and the chemical status, as well as the requirement on non-deterioration. There is the definition on environmental quality standards, and we have I think that's next. I think this is in Swedish the most, sorry for that, but there is all these single substances that has been regulated. But the most important here is what is required by the member states, and in the next stage from individuals by individuals. So it is important to say then that there is fundamental requirements in our general requirements from the treaties, and they are asking the member states to take actions, and they are obliged to achieve these objectives. They should do it. Their legislation should be clear and ambiguous, and that requirement is, of course, really difficult in relation to quite complex directive like the Water Framework Directive. But what has been argued here is how to implement mostly the ecological status. And there has been a discussion on that this is not an objective that is force the member states to achieve a certain result, but more to some kind of decision to eventually lead up to this objective. But there is by now a quite famous case from the ECG of 2015 that are very precisely declaring that this is an objective that is that the member states need to achieve, and it's not optional. And member states need to. It's not allowed to give permits, for example, for any industry or any activity that are in conflict with this achievement. So much more stricter than what many, at least in Sweden, thought from the start. There is also, if we then go to also the chemical status, requirements to fulfill, of course, the general objective, but also to take, considering this, the environmental quality standards when taking decisions on permits. So also relating to or demanding to set stricter conditions when it's necessary. And it's also clear that when it comes to activities that are included in the Industrial Emissions Directive, there needs to be consideration to the standards, and actually this is often a clear cost for the industry that asking for a permit. So there will be stricter requirements or conditions. Back to this picture. If we intend to discuss EQS for chemical mixture, we need to understand what is happening from the other side. Who is going to implement this? What are the demands on the member states, and what will they in their turn demand on the different actors? I think it's interesting also to discuss the method that is used for ecological status, because here we can see that there has been different parameters, different indicators, that there is a method of combining all these. And of course, in all these levels of defining ecological status, there is issues on uncertainty and how to deal with this. By now, I think during this time of the directive, the methodology has improved a lot and developed, and it's not as vague as it was from the start, because it has been used in different decisions and court decisions, etc. But the questioning of this method, I think, is interesting to study, because it's a case when we discuss now EQS for mixtures. And also this by using different types of quality elements. So I'm not saying that this is the model, but I think the discussion around the development of this model could be interesting to study further. Finally, also to remind us that the Marine Strategy Framework Directive have similar objectives and are also working with the descriptors in order to handle this type of issue also, and maybe a little more clearly in the objective about ensuring the collective pressures of activities. Finally, conclusions. Somewhere here. The first issue was already brought up, and it will not be an answer maybe on these 2 days, but I think it needs to be much more articulated and worked on, not just saying in non-toxic environment. We need to discuss the reference value, and that's also a lesson from discussing about ecological status. What do we actually mean? Working with the different types of environmental quality requirements. We don't need to just discuss environmental quality standard with a direct effect on agencies, member states, agencies, and individual. We can also talk about guidelines, alert values, guiding alert values. I heard something else today. Trigger value, yeah. So I think we also have pointed out the need of critical load values or standards. So to develop that type of legal instruments is, I think, essential here. And even if you can see that there is, what do you say, that to use EQS is to handle mixtures is I would say it's too late when it's already in the environment. So you need to do both, as already stated, with a combined approach. But still, I think to prevent further deterioration, an EQS on toxicity would be at least preventing further deterioration. And also to initiative measure in order to improve the other instruments like PPR or other legal instruments. Yes, and then finally, I think what we're doing today then to integrate knowledge was one of the problems. What we find out afterwards when talking about the Water Framework Directive, there was not really enough or sufficient collaboration between the legal scholars or the lawyers and the natural scientists. And I understand why it wasn't, because it's difficult and you need to go out on these loose areas where you don't feel comfortable. So I think we should join in that, and I think this is a good meeting then for doing that. Thank you.
About you write there monitoring scheme and methods.